What are we going to talk about today, gunfighters? How about the M14, the M1A, 1950's battle rifle Americana? How's that sound? Pretty cool? Well, stay tuned to Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, the right way, with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am blessed to serve you as host. As to why you should listen to what I have to say, I'm going to put in the bio. I will put in a rapid-fire version of the bio, as there's some housekeeping announcements and changes to the podcast, and then we'll get into the main topic. Blessed to have served in military, law enforcement, combat veteran, private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that He got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Let's dive into the podcast. Announcement for listeners. I'm going to try something new on the podcast. It's important to look at oneself soberly, circumspectly, see what one could do better. I think it's fair to say, by most measures, I put out quite a bit of content. A lot of podcasters do once a week. I've been doing, at least on weekdays, daily shows for quite a while, putting those out. And the podcast has grown, and I'm very blessed by that. But on things I could do better, things I could improve, I thought mistakenly that if I just grew the podcast and listenership, that percentage of people that became patrons would grow. That doesn't seem to be the case, although I'm very blessed and have gotten a few more patrons. It has not grown in direct proportion. I have, cashed out retirement accounts, took on another job, private security contracting, which makes quite a bit more money than the podcast. But if I want the podcast to grow, if I want it to make enough money that one day and make it the primary source of income, I should do something different. So here's the idea. Hopefully, put out at least one new episode a week on the general podcast platforms. Now, there may be more, but one a week. Because I think there's a substantial portion out there that thinks if I can get an episode every day for free, why would I go and pay for it? Fair. So, we're going to try this at least for a while and see if it helps. Now, if you're a fairly new listener, there's episodes on the major podcast platforms that go back to 2019. There's a lot of content. So, if you're a new listener, that shouldn't be an issue for a while. If you go back and listen to all those episodes and you want more, then hopefully you consider the podcast being worth something to you. I don't expect you to work for free. It is written, "You shall not muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain, and a laborer is worthy of his wages." I don't expect you to, fix my car for free, or I don't have grass. I live as a nomad, but if I did, I wouldn't expect you to come cut my grass for free. So if you think the podcast is worth something worth supporting, you want the greater amount of content, go to Patreon. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. And I shouldn't assume that you know what Patreon is. Patreon is a crowdsource funding way to support somebody that you care about their content. Sign up for a monthly amount. You can sign up for $5. You can sign up for more. And you'll get access not just to the new stuff, but all the old stuff too. And there's a lot of content on there. As of the time of this recording, there's over 1,300 posts on Patreon. There's a lot of content on there that's only for patrons. Some of that is Patreon-only episodes. Some of that is, which, by the way, is commercial-free. So if you're tired of those, that might be worth a few bucks right there. Some of it is written content. Some of it is photo. Some of it is video. If you're already on Patreon, you already know about it. It's Good Shepherd Training on Patreon. You should recognize it when you see it. If you do not want to become a monthly subscriber, you don't like monthly subscriptions, there's a small subset to whom that is the case. I will put many episodes on there a la carte. There is a shop on there. You can go buy an episode. Pick and choose, like this episode looks good. You can purchase that episode and listen to it. There's other things on there as well, but if you just want an episode, if you want to see what's new, because it's been a while, or you're used to a new episode every day, go there and check out, go to Patreon. You don't have to put in your credit card or anything to check out Patreon. Click the shop button, and you can do a one-time thing if you don't want to do a monthly purchase. We're going to try that for a while, see how it works. Hopefully it drives up the number of patrons. I really hope to see you there. So scroll down and hit that Patreon link in the show notes. As Ace Ventura would say, alrighty then, let's get into the main topic. The M14, the M1A, Battle Rifle Americana. Now, guys, there's a lot of fanboys of the M14, the M1A. There's a lot of people that think it's ridiculous. The truth obviously lies somewhere in the middle. My goal in this is to have equal weights and measures, present it fairly and equally. I can't really do an episode on the M14 and the M1A without getting into kind of the Cold War and proxy war like Vietnam. It's steeped in that it's twisted up so tight it's impossible to separate one from the other, I think, and do it justice. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history, realizing I'm not a tactical historian, right? If I say 1957 and it's 1957 and a half, it didn't come out till September, cut me a break on that stuff. But I think we do have to dive into a little bit of the history, and I'm not the greatest. I love history. I'm not the greatest when it comes to firearms history, because I mostly view firearms as tools, which we'll get into in the second part of this episode. How does the M14 stack up today? How does the M1A stack up today? What is it really? What is it good at? What is it not good at? We'll get into it as a practical tool in today's terms, right? As a 21st century fighter. We'll get into that in the second half. If I don't quote a source, it's probably coming from the old brain bank, and I don't remember where I got it. If I do use a source, I'll try and give credit where credit is due. The M14 is a box magazine fed, shoulder fired battle rifle. This is the last of the American battle rifles. It feeds from a detachable 20-round box magazine. It was the first military weapon, I believe, to use the 7.62x51 NATO, or in civilian vernacular, the 308. I know there's minor differences. If you blow up yourself or your gun, that's your fault. I know I missed my calling as a lawyer. But I do believe it was the first American service arm developed for the 308. And it is 20-round detachable box magazine fed. It feeds from a metal rock and lock, much like the AK style of rock and lock magazine. It's not a straight insert like many modern rifles today. It weighs about 9 pounds. It has a similar bayonet mounting system. It has a similar, although not identical, operating system. And I'm not the firearms engineer, historian, nerd to tell you all the difference. There's nothing wrong with that. But the difference in the operating system between this and the M1 Garand, of which it replaced. But there are some minor differences. But basically, there's a lot of similarity there. It has a reciprocating charging handle. It has a piston system. It has very similar sights. It weighs about 9 pounds. Now, after WW2, which the Garand did very well, they thought, it's good. But we saw some things during the war. There are some things we could improve, we could change. And I don't know who this we is, some military commission. But they started looking at the next generation, or the development of this American battle rifle. They liked the performance of the 30-06 as I understand, and they thought, how can we get similar performance out of a shorter cartridge? Shorter cartridge does some things. If all other things being equal, if you shorten the action a little bit, the rifle gets a little bit lighter. Now, this doesn't really matter to the individual soldier, but the ammo is also a little bit lighter. If you're talking about carrying 100 rounds of 30-06 or 100 rounds of 308, the difference in that length of brass is probably inconsequential. If you're talking about shipping, hundreds of thousands of rounds from proper naval vessels onto landing craft onto a beach and running those by hand up the beach while getting shot at by machine guns, which is a thing that happened in World War II, if you're talking about that amount of ammo, the difference in weight is not inconsequential. So as far as a logistics train goes, that makes quite a bit of sense. So they thought, how can we kind of duplicate this performance of the standard military loading? I forget if it was a 147 or a 149 grain military load in a shorter cartridge, and they did. Now, hold on. 308 is not just as good as, it's not just as powerful as 30-06, especially in civilian loadings. But they did, I think, duplicate that 30-06 military loading, because as much as you might love the M1 Garand, it's not built to handle full-powered modern 30-06 loads. There are M1 Garand loads that are a bit lighter than modern standard like hunting loads. The original military 308 load duplicated that 30-06 load and did it with a lighter, shorter, handier cartridge, which today we would call a short action. I don't think that was a term at the time, but because 308 became so common, we refer to all that pattern and its children as short actions, like 243, 708. Right, they're short action cartridges. So that was a big change. They also went from the 8-round M-block clip magazines. They're not horrible, but they're not a detachable box magazine. They went to a detachable box magazine. It is a rock and lock insert, which for combat you could argue is probably fine, right? You're not trying to run a 3-gun match. There are some advantages to rock and lock magazines. They're not quick. They're not as fast. The straight insert, but they're also more positive retention. So they went with a detachable box magazine, a 20-round detachable box magazine, as opposed to an 8-round M-block load from the top. It's a 20-round load from the bottom, right? Which, to load an M1 Garand, you have to take it out of your shoulder. You could probably do it in the shoulder, but the proper way to do it, the only technique I've ever seen fast, is to take it out of your shoulder, bring it down, throw the clip in the top, and bring it back into your shoulder. If you know what you're doing with a bottom box magazine fed gun, you can keep it up in your shoulder. When something like a tack reload, you can keep one in the pipe, you can keep a round in the chamber, and insert the fresh magazine, while all the while keeping the adversary downrange and in your sights. Well, that's an advantage. They also, I think, tried and quickly realized it wasn't going to work. I don't know how quickly, but they wanted it to also stand in as like a submachine gun, a Browning BAR replacement, which is one of the big criticisms of this gun, is that it's not controllable in full auto from the shoulder. It's just not. I guess I should clarify. It's like controllable as in you can shoot it somewhere 180 degrees down range and not shoot yourself in the face. It's controllable like that. But as far as combat effectiveness, getting consecutive hits on targets that are trying to kill you, not super controllable on full auto. So it didn't really accomplish that task. And they put a full auto button on there, which kind of is sad for us, because if they hadn't put the full auto mechanism on there, we probably could get the military versions through the CMP on the civilian market. But since they were originally designed as a machine gun, and as far as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer as far as class 3 stuff, but you can't, once something's a machine gun, it's always a machine gun. You have to destroy the receiver. Once the receiver was a machine gun, it's always a machine gun, which stopped it from getting sold in mass on the civilian market, which is kind of sad. But it never really did accomplish that task. To be fair, I think it did accomplish the task of becoming a decent battle rifle in 308, at least for the time. Here's the thing, though. The times they were a-changin'. You could make the argument, I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying one could make the argument that by the time this came out, the days of the battle rifle as a main-line infantry issue were dead. They still have their niche roles. They still today have their niche roles. But the era of the big bore battle rifle, the full-powered battle rifle, was dead before they started the M14 program. You could make that argument because the Germans had their successful submachine guns during the war, and you would argue the Germans maybe made the first successful mass-produced assault rifle. Right, this was the last battle rifle. After this, the military would en masse for infantry adopt assault rifles. The Germans did it during the war, and the Soviets, with the very prolific, even today, AK-47, did this right after the war, as you might imagine, 1947. This M14 came out in the 50s. So you might argue they were developing a really good thing whose time was already past. I'm not saying I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think there is still a role, and that's why you still see it in service in very niche applications for a full-powered battle rifle. But as far as mass infantry adoption, the era of the assault rifle had already begun before this was issued. And this is where I'll go to Wikipedia. Per Wikipedia, it became a standard issue rifle in 1957, replacing the M1 Garand. In service with the U.S. Army by 58 and the U.S. Marine Corps by 65. As I can say from being in both the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army, the Marines are often the last to get stuff with some of the worst equipment. They're not great warfighters because they have the best equipment. That's much more of a mindset, tenacity, speed, surprise, violence of action thing. I'm not reading this article verbatim. It's not gospel. I'm skipping down a little bit. In 1967, was officially replaced by the M16. So 57 to 67, that's 10 years. And the first ones weren't even issued by 57. It says 58. And the Marines didn't get it till 65. It was replaced in 67. That makes it one of the shortest lived service rifles, if not the shortest. I'm not the greatest historian. Maybe like the Lee Navy or something was shorter. But the shortest service rifle ever is officially replaced by the M16 assault rifle. It says here a lighter weapon with a smaller 5.56 by 45 intermediate cartridge. The M14 remains in limited service across all branches of the U.S. military, with variants used as sniper and designated marksman rifles. M14 served as the basis for the M21 and M25 sniper rifles. Some things I didn't know: the original bayonet was the M6 bayonet. Alright guys, here's where we start turning the corner into what is it in and of itself. Like, what is this rifle apart from the nostalgia and the history? I should mention that I have some real-world first-hand experience with the M14. The actual M14 is one of my first competition rifles. I like the M14. I have a lot of hours training with the M14. I could probably still disassemble it and reassemble it blindfolded in the dark with COVID-19. Like, I'm very familiar with the rifle. I do like the rifle. I like it because I love shooting iron sights, and I love shooting precision with iron sights. And this has very, very good iron sights. It also has a very good out-of-the-box trigger. Kind of a two-stage, but as far as military rifles go, it's got a good trigger. So I like the rifle for training, for shooting. Here's the rub, though. It weighs 9 pounds. I don't care how fast you are, and in modern warfare, moving is a thing. I don't care how fast you are, the more weight you have to carry, the less fast you are, right? The slower you become. Speed versus mobility is a thing. I don't care if you're the biggest jacked up dude, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you double his amount of steroids, right? The more weight you carry, the slower you go. That's just how math works. It's a heavy, heavy rifle. It's a box magazine fed 308. I like 308. I've said for like the apocalypse, picking one cartridge, I wouldn't normally pick a rifle for a long gun, but if I was picking a rifle, I would probably pick 308. So check the box. It's a fantastic cartridge, right? One of the big successes of the M14 kind of transition was not actually the M14 rifle. It was the 308 it was designed to shoot. They kind of went hand in hand in development. But, you know, the 308 is wildly more successful than the M14 and its variants ever have been. The 308 is one of the de facto calibers of our time, and it's probably the best crossover caliber for survival, for both putting meat on the table and hunting and defense. It's heavier, yes. Can I carry less of it? Yes, but round per round it's more effective. You have to ask yourself if that's worth it. Now, I live in the Wild West region of the United States. If I lived east of the Mississippi, where most of the deer are probably going to be gone in most disasters because their population density there is crazy, and you're probably more likely to get shot out hunting in such a disaster than actually getting a deer. But I don't live there. If I lived there, I might look at the 5.56. But for where I live, as I've said, if I was picking a gun for the end of the world as we know it, and it was going to be a rifle, it would probably be a 308. So it checks the box there. It's a 308. It's semi-automatic. And I don't care how much you love your bolt rifle, it's not keeping up with a semi-automatic. Period. It's a box magazine fed, which is really good. It's not a straight insert, which is not really good. It's okay. It's a very okay-ish form of reloading. But so is the AK-47, and people still use that. It does have some advantage. Accuracy. Yes, they do use it as a sniper rifle. It was very accurate, I think, for Cold War standards. I want to be sober and realistic about this. It's not a hyper-accurate rifle as far as mechanically accurate goes. I like it because it's very nice to shoot well. With a good sling and a good just pair of good iron sights, you can do some crazy cool stuff with the M14. However, by today's standards, it's not crazy accurate. It doesn't have a free flow to barrel. It has a wood stock. Although it's been used as a designated marksman rifle, it's because it's what they had in inventory. And that may offend you, but that's why they used it, because that's what they had in inventory. If they'd had fouls in inventory, they would have used a foul. They needed a bigger, heavier hitting, longer range cartridge than the 5.56, and that's what they had, and that's why they use it, because it's what they had, and they had a ton of them in inventory because they mass adopted them and they vomited them out of their mouth. So they had a bunch of them in mothball. That's why they used them, not because they're the most hyper-accurate, sniperist, killing system that ever existed, because they had them. If you know much about military bureaucracies and logistics supply trains, it's a lot easier to use something you have than to purchase something that's not been approved. So, again, that's a big reason of why they use them. Not because it's the bestest, most killingest, most hyper-accurate rifle ever. So just be real about that. Now, I wasn't around at the time. There's been a lot of much ado about the early hiccups with the M16 in Vietnam. Now, that was a pretty rushed job. Like, they mass adopted that and put it in the field pretty quickly. Generally, when you do that with any gun, you're going to get teething issues. And I'm not the biggest fan of the M16. I'm not a AR-15 sycophant. You guys that have listened for any length of time know that. I had a catastrophic failure of my M16 during the war. Not Vietnam. The invasion of Iraq. That said, from what I think I've heard, and again, I wasn't there, but the M14 was never known for being crazy reliable. So you can get mad about how unreliable the M16 is, but I don't think the M14 in Vietnam was known for being hyper reliable. And you can say, well, I've got my M1A and I've taken it to the range 3 times and it's never malfunctioned. Okay, well, crawl through a rice paddy and then dump a liter of blood into the receiver. And then tell me how it does. Because that's like a real world battle condition. So I don't know that they're more or less reliable than the M16. Now let's talk about variance today. This is going to make a certain subsection of you guys very happy. You guys probably know, if you're regular listeners, that I often, like a little baby, defecate all over the diaper of Springfield Armory. I think they make a lot of guns that are just almost, they don't work. The Springfield XD, Croatian-made Wonder 9, no thanks. I've literally never seen one of those used by a professional make it through a professional training class. Ever. Never seen a cop you get one that seriously used it and carried it on duty that didn't break. Never seen one make it through a training class. I don't know. Well, this may be a theory as to how Springfield Armory is still in existence. Realize the Springfield Armory that makes the M1A, which is a civilian variant of the M14, the M1A, It has nothing to do with other than buying the name, the actual Springfield Armory that was a military arsenal for the U.S. government. But the Springfield M1A is one of their guns that's not horrible. Now, it's not an M14. It's not a forged receiver. It's a cast receiver. If you want like a actual legit forged receiver, you got to go to Fulton Armory. They're the only ones I know of that make a forged receiver that you can get new. But the Springfield M1A is not horrible. I've owned one of them. I shot one of them. It wasn't a bad gun. They're not cheap guns. They're, last I checked, and this at the time of this recording, like the base models are like $1,500-ish. They're not bad. If you don't mind the cast receiver and if you're shooting it for recreation, not bad. They make a bunch of different variants. And here's where I want to be sober, right? If just cutting 8 inches of barrel off, going from a 22-inch barrel, which I think is what the M14 has, to a 16-inch tanker model or whatever, if that made it a modern rifle, then I think it was Secretary of Defense McNamara would have just cut 8 inches off the M14 and rocked it in Vietnam. They didn't do that. It's still a battle rifle. That doesn't make it modern by chopping a bunch of inches off, and it takes quite a bit of the power off of the 308 itself. One of the big things that holds this back is optics mounting. You can mount optics on it just like you can mount optics on an AK-47. And I love iron sights, but I'm not such a Luddite as to say that good optics are not a force multiplier. They absolutely are. To be fair to the rifle, it was designed, in a 1950s battle rifle era. Mass issuance of optics was not a thing. It was not designed with that in mind. And although there are ways to mount optics, it's kind of a kludgy workaround. It's not as good as, in my opinion, and I think in reality, as a gun that's made from jump to be able to mount good optics. It can be done, just like it can be done on an AK, but it's not as good as a good, pick rail milled into the receiver. By happenstance, the M16 was not designed in an era for that either, but the design easily lent itself to later flat top receivers. They could easily go from the carry handle, of which I started in the military with, and go to a flat top upper and mount something like an ACOG. It lends itself better to that. The M14 does not. The M1A does not. Fulton Armory designs, same thing. Again, you can mount an optic on them, and yes, they do use them as designated marksman rifles because that's what they have. But it's a workaround. So realize you're getting a rifle that's a workaround. Also, it's not free-floated, which may or may not matter to you. If you lay your rifle on a sandbag and it moves the point of aim, point of impact 2 inches at 100 yards, does that matter to you? Maybe, maybe not. And I don't know if that's exactly what it's going to move it. That would depend on a lot of factors. Your individual rifle, how much pressure you're putting on it. But it's not free-floated. So if you put pressure on the forend and a rifle's not free-floated, you have the potential to move where your gun's going to shoot in relation to where you're aiming. That's why free-floated barrels are a thing. This does not have a free-floated barrel. There are things you can do to bed the action, but then you get into issues with disassembling, reassembling, pressures, all kinds of things like that. So, again, I want to be sober about this. I like the rifle, I really do. But that is, again, not real modern. And the big one is weight, right? Even the smaller 16-inch versions are still pretty hefty. So, soberly, in today's world, where does it land? Well, it's still a good box magazine fed, albeit heavy, battle rifle in .308. If that's what you want, there's a lot of other options. If you also want Cold War nostalgia, this is probably it. This is probably the best one on the American market. Now, you could make an argument that the FAL is a better design. You can even make the argument that the Italian BM-59 is a better Cold War battle rifle. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but there's way more on the American aftermarket for the M14 M1A style design than there is for those other variants. This is a small niche market of people that still want to run Cold War battle rifles, but it's the biggest of that subset. You're really talking a niche inside a niche when you start looking at a FAL. Right? The days of cheap FAL assembly kits are long gone. I don't see them coming back. If you want a Cold War full-sized battle rifle, the last of an era of full-powered wood and, steel full-powered rifles, military style, this is probably your best bet. Now, it's not the best 308 battle rifle on the market today. I'm saying if the Cold War 1950s Americana nostalgia is important to you, then it's good. Another thing I should mention, the ergonomics by modern standards are not great. By the standards of the day, they're right up there with an AK-47. But like the safety, you got to put your finger inside the trigger to disengage the safety. Not great by today's standards, not fast by today's standards. Magazine insertion, not great by today's standards. No free flow to barrel, not great by today's standards. 9 pounds, 9 pounds. And we're talking naked. We're not talking loaded with an optic, with a sling. And they're not crazy expensive if you're talking about a base model Springfield. But if you're talking about a military version of a forged receiver, Fulton Armory, last I checked, those were in the $3,000 to $4,000-ish price range. That's SCAR 17 price range. And you'd have to show me, other than Cold War nostalgia, how the gun is any better than a SCAR 17. So be real if you get one. Is it a good 308 battle rifle? Yeah. Do I think there's better on the market today? Yes. Is it cool? Yes. Does it have Cold War nostalgia? Yes. But be sober about it and don't pretend that if it was the best military killingness weapon of all time for mainline infantry troops, it probably, let's be honest, wouldn't be the shortest lived mainline issue infantry weapon, or one of the shortest lived in American history. It's a good rifle, but be sober about what it is. It's a good 1950s tech main battle rifle. It's beautiful. It's a very good gun if you want to shoot well with iron sights. Hey guys, if you liked this episode, you probably heard the Patreon plug in the beginning. Instead of new episodes daily, I'm putting a lot of stuff out on Patreon. If you like this episode, you may also like CZ75 episode, which should be coming out on Patreon. Also, I did a fun chat on there, call it an episode, on just cool other Cold War battle rifles and their modern variants of today, like the FAL, like the Galil, things like that. Episode just for patrons. Some things scheduled right now on Patreon that you're just not going to get unless you become a patron. Trade-offs we make in guns. One example of that is like in handguns, concealability versus shootability. There's a lot of other examples of inverse relationships and trade-offs we make in guns. A deep philosophical discussion, if you will, on centerfire rifles versus shotguns for your apocalyptic needs. Some other things scheduled. Trapping as part of the survival and bug out plan. A Twilight Zone episode. Kind of fun. Those are just things scheduled to come out on Patreon. I put a lot of stuff out on Patreon just like, oh, here's a good deal on ammo. Here's a good deal on guns. Here's what I think about this. You ever wonder what I listen to for podcasts? I put a lot of stuff like that on there, like not mine but good. This is a good episode of a good podcast. There's some really cool chats on there, like the golden age of what forums used to be. There's a lot of really cool stuff on Patreon. So please consider becoming a patron. And I'm trying to put a lot of stuff out on Patreon to get you to go to Patreon and become a patron. I don't expect you guys to work for free. Right, this is work for me. So hopefully you appreciate that and want to support the podcast. Consider going to Patreon. With that, your tactical tip of the day. One of the things I like about the M14 is, if you're not familiar with it, on the trigger guard, you pull it back and lift it up and the entire trigger mechanism comes out. And then the stock comes off. That entire trigger mechanism being one monolithic piece is pretty cool. Your tactical tip, not all lube is the same for guns. For fine things like that, like a firing mechanism, I like more fine oil, like a REM oil, or a very fine, thin oil. CLP would be about as thick as I would want to go. On big reciprocating parts, if we're using the M14, like the operating rod spring guide, the charging handle, which is one piece that houses the operating rod spring guide. If you can tell, I have a bit of experience with that rifle. For bigger mass-moving parts like that, the bolt carrier group, you might consider a more thick, viscous lubricant, like a grease, as long as you're not in too crazy cold of an environment. But not all lubricants are the same. I'm not a big fan of using just one kind of lubricant on your whole gun unless it's just what you have. But bigger, more massive reciprocating parts, I like a thicker, more viscous lubricant. And for things that are refined, like the trigger mechanism, I like a little finer, thinner lubricant. Be careful of accumulating too much lube in things like firing pin channels. That's your tactical tip of the day, your tactical verse of the day. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him, and to him you shall hold fast. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.